Greetings and salutations. Welcome to the EzeeLinux show. This is version 18.0, recorded on December the 29th, 2017. By the time you see this particular show, it will probably be 2018, so we start by wishing you a happy new year. This is a new thing we're going to be doing here on this channel. I'm Joe Collins. I'm your host. EzeeLinux is a project that is a community outreach to help people get started with Linux. Now, up until this video, what I have posted on YouTube has been about stuff, mainly about Linux stuff. And I've done videos where I have shown you how to do things, explained different things about how to use Linux and how to get started with it. Some of the videos have been my opinion. Now, those videos are great, and they are wonderful for helping people get started. Some videos have had more views than others over the last few years that I've been doing this. The only problem with doing videos like that is it doesn't build community. It just builds people who want to watch videos, which is perfectly fine. But in 2018, I want to kind of change direction a little bit. What I want to do is build community around EzeeLinux. And the best way to do that is to provide content to the people in the community and ensure that those who are subscribed to this channel, watching this channel, are those who are interested in what EzeeLinux is all about and what I have to say. So that is why we're making the big change. And the nice thing is, this does not rope me into having to talk about whatever subject is in the video description or in the title for the video the entire time. So some people will see a video that says how to set up SSH, for instance. And then if I say anything that doesn't have anything to do with that, they start screaming the video's too long. Well, this gets around that, because these videos are going to be about 30 minutes each. Could be as short as 20, could be as long as an hour. It depends on what kind of content we got. That's kind of how I've been doing it anyway. But from now on, this is a show. And the subject of this show could be one thing, it could be 5 things, it could be a number of different ideas that are presented during each show. And I'm going to try and have one of these up once a week. And this way we can talk about continuing things, and we can do things that build community in a more pleasant way that doesn't, make people angry and go, "You talk too much." Well, if you like to hear me talk, thank you for listening. I'm glad you're here. If you don't, then you don't have to watch. It's really that simple. It's about community building. So, usually what I plan to do here is in the first couple of minutes of these shows is talk a little bit about news that's affecting the Linux world. It's kind of quiet right now because everybody in Linux kind of takes off for the holidays, and so we won't do that, but I will give you this update from the last video. Cindy is doing much better. She is probably going to be home either later this evening or early tomorrow morning, and so we are very happy about that around here and looking forward to it. She has spent the entire holiday in the hospital. Turned out the heart condition, which I mentioned in the earlier video, was not necessarily what was causing her the problems. She had several things going on at once, but she's going to be fine. She's not going to require any surgery as far as we know, so this is all wonderful. And I want to say thank you to everybody who was so kind to post on Facebook, on the comments for the last video, good wishes towards Cindy. I have told her about them, and she's very much thrilled that people around the world were kind enough to take the time to do that. So thank you very much. It is certainly appreciated. So, by the way, I just love this graphic. I found this on Google, and for those of you who are looking on small devices or just listening to the video, it's it's really kind of cute. It's a picture of 2 penguins, and they're holding up Happy New Year, and then there's a little cabin in the back, and you notice that the window sort of looks like Microsoft Windows, and then there's a message up in the corner that says, "Honey, throw some more dollar bills on the fire. I'm freezing again," and it's kind of cute. So That's what I found to wish you guys a happy new year. So, what are we going to talk about in this particular show? I want to cover a couple of subjects. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about some predictions that I have for 2018 when it comes to Linux and what I think is going to happen. And maybe talk a little bit about 2017 and what happened. But everybody else on YouTube has already done that. That's the big deal at the end of the year. Now, everybody who provides Linux content on YouTube does a video where they go back over all the stories. And I don't care. You don't care. I'm worried about the future. Let's move on. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about here is Linux market share in 2017. This was a really, really good year for Linux. Now, we are looking at the net market share site. You can Google that. It's the first thing that pops up when you put in desktop market share, and they do it for all kinds of different devices and browsers and all kinds of stuff. And we're looking at Linux as they reported in 2017. And I must preface what I'm going to say here with the fact that these numbers are subjective. They are there are people inside the Linux community who say that this is not an accurate representation of how many people actually use Linux. I don't really know how they gather all this information. That is probably for another video or another time or whatever, even if I don't really care. This is what they're saying, okay? And everybody goes by this in the mainstream tech world. So we're going to quote their numbers, even though they're probably goofy. And you can see that Linux actually did pretty good this year. It has hovered between 2 and 3%. So the low that I see on this chart is like 1.9 something. And then the high is 2.96. There was a period of time earlier in the year when the numbers were reporting that it was way up there, like 3, 4, 5, 6%, and then they were quote-unquote adjusted. But the main point here is the fact that Linux has grown so much in the last 5 years, it's not even funny. I mean, 5 years ago, they were reporting 1% or under, and now they're saying mainstream desktop use now is right around 3%, 2.5%, 3%. And you may say to yourself, well, that's not many people, man. Look at Windows. They still got like 80% of the market share. Brian Lunduke pointed this out in one of his shows where he was doing his retrospective, and that was, he said that stop and think about how many people use computers, period, and then take 3% of that, and you still come up with millions and millions of people. And from a business point of view, that is a market. That is a big market. That's a market that is willing to spend money on software, on hardware. So I agree with him 100% on that. Linux is no longer a off-in-the-corner niche, should not be treated as such. So therefore, I am no longer going to be evangelizing Linux or fighting the idiots that are reading stuff from 10 years ago and trying to set the world straight. I'm going to talk about using Linux every day. If you want to get on that wagon, that's great. If you don't, then go away. I don't care. The other thing that I plan to do this year is I have made up my mind about what direction I want this to go in. Of course, with feedback from the community. I don't want to make this sound like all stilted and stentorian and all that stuff. No. But I'm not going to sit here and worry about what every other distro is doing. We're going to focus on Linux Mint because I'd say 90% of the people that I work with are using Linux Mint. And we're going to talk about Ubuntu because there's really big things that are happening with Ubuntu this year and Linux Mint. We are waiting for Ubuntu 18.04. And when that comes along, that's going to be a really big distro. It's going to set a trend for pretty much everybody else. It usually does. Whenever the Canonical folks release a long-term support version, it's a big deal to everybody else. And this one's going to be a big deal. Now, I know there's the problem right now with 1710 where if you install it on certain laptops, I think they were talking about Lenovo's and Acer's, that it's trashing some of the chips, and I say, well, there you go. I go back to the video that I posted not too long ago about buying hardware for Linux. And I caught a lot of flack for that, because in that I said, if you're going to buy a new computer, buy a computer that's ready to run Linux from a company that is selling hardware that has computers that run Linux. I realize that that's harder in certain parts of the world, and you may not be able to do that. But we are getting to a place where if you want to run Linux, you're going to have specific hardware built to do that. And the people that are pushing that are Microsoft, because Microsoft is trying to push the market in a direction where the machines built to run Windows will run Windows exclusively. We'll talk more about that later on, because that ties into the next subject that I want to get into. So, yeah, if you're going to buy a used computer, buy one that's 3, 4, 5 years old. You're probably good as gold. It works fine. I personally do not buy new computers. I buy junk. I buy stuff off eBay and scrounge. I do not have a computer in this house other than one that was given to me by somebody who, one of the EzeeLinux community members sent me a little Acer book, a little netbook thing to play with, and that's a new computer. It runs Linux, and it works quite well, but all of the other machines I'm using are old, because the way I do it is I find machines that are in really good shape, refurbed, and get them and then modify them to do what get them to do what I want them to do. That's how I do it. But if you're going to buy a brand new machine to run Linux, buy one that runs Linux. And that whole garbage about what happened with the Lenovo's installing Ubuntu 17.10, it's trashing the BIOS. There you go. Okay, going down to the box store, grabbing the cheapest laptop you can find off the shelf, and then trying to shoehorn Linux on it is fast becoming something that doesn't work. So, there you go. That's proof. Anyway, by the time 1804 comes along, that should be pretty much straightened out. I certainly should hope so. And it's going to be a huge distribution, and so much of what is done in the Linux community is based on Ubuntu to begin with, that, like Linux Mint, for instance, the main version of Linux Mint is based on Ubuntu. So Linux Mint 19 will more than likely be based on Ubuntu 1804, because that's how Linux Mint works these days. It's based on the long-term support version. Elementary OS is based on Ubuntu, so there will be a version of Elementary. KDE Neon is based on Ubuntu. This goes on and on. There are other things like Zorin, Peppermint, whatever. All of these weird little distros that are based on Ubuntu. So whatever they do affects a lot of other people. So we'll be looking at that for sure. That's something we're going to talk about. Now, whether I talk about other distros that are not in the Debian Ubuntu family, probably not. Because really, honestly, folks, people who come to Linux for the first time, they're starting out with Ubuntu, they're starting out with Linux Mint, and then later on they may move on to something else. That's where the action is, and that's where I'm going to stay. So that's kind of the plan for the future here. We're going to be, it's like living with Linux. That's what I want to talk about. Now, I do want your input on this. I mean, what things do you want to talk about? What do you want to know? If you're starting out with Linux, I'm assuming that you have it installed on your computer and you're learning your way around. Keep sending those comments and suggestions, because they end up in videos. I mentioned in the last video that one of the things I kind of want to do as the year progresses is go through some of the older videos as well and kind of redo them and update them and talk about things, because I've been posting steadily about Linux for about 4 years now. And some of the stuff that applied to Ubuntu 14.04 or Linux Mint 17 series doesn't apply anymore. So we're going to work on that as we progress. But I think it's going to be a big year for Linux. I think we're going to see this market share go up. I think we're going to hear more and more about it. I think we're going to have more big companies start coming to Linux. And I think that the ones who historically have dug their heels in and we're not messing with Linux, they're going to get left behind. And it's mainly because of the way the market is going. The world is going more toward open source, and it's not going to be like the year of the Linux desktop. I don't think we'll ever see a year of the Linux desktop, but it's always this people out there who are getting sick and tired of dealing with proprietary software and the problems that go along with it, and the security risks and the vendor lock-in and all that stuff. And I think more and more people are turning away from that, and they're doing it individually and as companies. So I think that will continue to happen. So let's move on to the next thing that we want to talk about in this here video. I want to talk about a couple of things that came in over the last couple of days. And just as a side note, some of you guys might find this interesting. I was looking for a way to display text in a terminal that wouldn't put any other garbage up on the screen and would be easy to manipulate. And I actually could not find anything that would do that. So I wrote something that would do that. I came up with a whole new little program and called it Show, just so I could show text and have it justified properly in the right column length and all that stuff on the screen. You'll be seeing a lot more of Show. This is what it looks like. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into the questions. A couple of things I wanted to comment on. First of all, this first one comes from Gabe, and he says, Joe, I know you are not a proponent of dual booting necessarily. That being said, I'm still having trouble getting my system to dual boot properly. I stumbled upon a web page that seems to indicate Microsoft has a feature that disables non-Microsoft UEFI kernels. So I said, okay. So I followed the link. And I went to this page here, which is the link. And this is a program called EzeeBCD, which you load on Windows, and it will allow you to take control of your bootloader, and you can add all kinds of other stuff to it. They have a pretty good description on this page about secure boot, and they have how to get around it and how to turn it off, and then they talk about putting things in a virtual machine, and it's basically stuff that I have been preaching for a long time. And I just show that as an example. And I posted a video probably about 3 years ago. So, Gabe, thank you for bringing this up because it's something that I hear all the time. People ask about dual booting, and I always tell them don't do it. I put up a video about 3 years ago called The Dual Boot Deception. It is by far the most misunderstood video I have ever posted, and it generates comments to this day because people did not get it. They didn't understand what I was saying. I thought I had made it perfectly clear. So let me restate my position on dual booting once again. Okay, when you install Linux for the first time, and it gets to the part of the page in the Ubiquity installer, which is what the name of the program is that installs Linux Mint or Ubuntu, and many other distributions use something similar. There is always that choice that says install Ubuntu alongside whatever is already installed on the computer. This has been around in Linux for a very long time. And the problem is that people who do not understand how computers work, do not understand what a bootloader is, they do not understand how the computer boots. How does it get from the BIOS to the kernel? And people that do not understand how partitions work will select this option, and then all of a sudden they run into problems with the dual boots later, either immediately or down the road, and they have no clue how to fix it. None whatsoever. They don't know how to get rid of it. They don't even know how to follow the directions that you find online. And we're talking now about 3 or 4 years ago, before UEFI became a standard, before Secure Boot was pushed on the industry by Microsoft. And even 3 or 4 years ago, people were getting in trouble. And now that most of the machines sold, pretty much all of them have Secure Boot installed, and you have to disable that or know how to disable that to get a dual boot to work. And then, by the way, Windows 10, Microsoft really does not like the idea of dual booting. They don't want you to do that. I mean, this is part of the motivation why Microsoft has included Ubuntu, OpenSUSE, and Fedora in the Windows Store. They just integrated the, what was it? Not Bash, it was SSH server into Windows. You used to have to use PuTTY. You don't have to do that anymore. They don't want you to dual boot. They do not want you to go away from Windows. Microsoft says they love Linux, but I'm telling you, Microsoft, I have watched them over the last 3 or 4 years chip away at the freedom that you have to install whatever the hell you want to onto an x86 PC. They feel like that they own that platform, and they're doing everything they can to make it harder for people to install Linux on those computers. And dual booting with Windows 10, unless you are an expert, unless you know exactly how to work with the EFI bootloader and you understand what that is doing, it's dangerous. And even those that do get their systems, their Linux partitions wiped out by Microsoft updates. It happens all the time. And this is why I tell people, don't dual boot. Don't dual boot. You want to use Windows, that's entirely up to you. Don't try and share the space on the same computer with Linux. Unless you know exactly what you're doing, you keep good backups, and you're ready to deal with any problems that may pop up. But as far as I know, if you take Linux Mint or Ubuntu, and you take a machine with Windows on it, and you try and use that option to set up a dual boot, it will fail. It may work some of the time, it may not work at all. If you have secure boot enabled, it's definitely not going to work. It's not going to allow you to do it. If you disable secure boot, you have a better shot of having that work automatically. And I deal with this with people all the time who ask me about installing Linux. I have to first tell them to go into their BIOS and disable secure boot. And every manufacturer does that differently. Every single manufacturer does secure boot differently. So there's no way that I can tell you step by step how to do it. I have to tell people, okay, what computer do you have? Here are the instructions. You go do that. And then if I'm going to help you get started, this is how it's going to do it. And if you throw a dual boot into that scenario, and I'm dealing with people who, like I said, they don't understand kernels, they don't understand bootloaders, BIOS, EFI, have no idea what any of this stuff, they're completely lost. That's my position on dual booting. I can't support you with a dual boot because I'm not sitting in front of your system. There are no hard and fast rules. Every time that somebody figures out how to get a dual boot to work properly with Windows 10, Microsoft changes the rules. So I don't deal with dual boots. Now, moving on to the second question here. Hi, you're doing a great job. Well, you guys are doing a great job. It's just me, ladies and gentlemen. Keep it up. I actually have a question and would like to know what your opinion or views are on it. I've been reading that Microsoft is wanting to fund or has started to fund some Linux distros and the Linux Foundation. I personally think it's a tactic to stop the growth of Linux or something shady like that. What is your take on that situation? Well, as far as the Linux Foundation is concerned, Microsoft actually sits on the board. They bought themselves a seat on the board. There are a lot of people on the board at the Linux Foundation, a lot of big companies. Google is there. Anybody who benefits or works with Linux. What do I think Microsoft is doing? And that ties into this other question. Now, you'll notice that if you have Windows loaded on a computer, they've pretty much done everything they can to make it really hard to put Linux on alongside it. You can install Ubuntu with Bash from the Windows Store. You can install VirtualBox or some other virtualizing software, and you can run Linux within a virtual machine on Windows if you want to. They're not doing anything to block that at all, but they don't want you to run Windows side by side. But yet, they say they love Linux, and it seems like every time we turn around, we find that some part of Linux is either brought into Windows or it's vice versa, that Windows is making some subsystem that historically is only run on Windows available on Linux. What's going on there? What's the deal? Well, as far as the enterprise world is concerned, you have to realize that Microsoft and any computer company that's selling hardware and software, they have two markets. They have the consumer market and then they have the enterprise market. And Microsoft has lost a lot of ground in the enterprise market to free and open source software like Linux or one of the BSDs. And so therefore, it's getting to a place where they're the odd man out as far as their technology is concerned. Most of the internet runs on Linux or some form of Unix. Windows doesn't have a whole lot in common with the base code base of that, with, Unix and Linux. And so therefore, ladies and germs, they're getting to a point where the tide is turning so strongly against them that they either have to embrace this technology and start integrating with it, or they're going to get left behind in the enterprise market. Now, as far as consumer desktops are concerned, they don't care one way or the other. But even on a consumer Windows 10 installation, you can run Linux and use SSH now. It's just something you click and install. So my personal opinion is that Microsoft, Windows is such old code, and it goes so far back to, it's based on DOS. It is so old that it's getting to a point where they are the maverick and everybody else is working off of Linux or a Unix-based system, that I'm wondering whether Microsoft at some point is not going to shift their base to Linux. It would make sense, because they're the only people that are doing what they're doing right now. They're it. I mean, if you look at Google, they have Chromebooks and they have Android phones. Well, they're based on Linux. They use a Linux kernel, both of those platforms. If you look at Apple, everything Apple is based on BSD Unix, which is kind of like Linux in a lot of ways. Microsoft's the only person out there, or the only company out there that's doing that. And I honestly believe that what they're working their way up to doing is, I think we're going to see a Microsoft developed Linux distribution come out. I've actually said this for a long time. I think they're working their way up to a day when they're going to offer MS Linux. And it is going, I don't know how it's going to work. I don't know what whether it's going to be free and open, or whether it's going to be locked down but it's going to be Linux compatible. I have no idea what the tiny little minds at Microsoft are working on, but it kind of is getting to a point for them, at least in the enterprise space, where the whole Windows thing is just, Windows has become, from a tech point of view, I mean, from people who are working in development and working from the more Linux nerds, basically, and Unix nerds, from this point of view, if you look at Windows, it's a dumpster fire. It doesn't work. It's not just that it's not free and it's not open, and it's not just that it's spying on you, and it's not just all of this other garbage that you hear banded around. As an operating system, it sucks. If you could have seen what I've seen, how many machines that were running Windows 10 that you put Linux on and suddenly the machine takes off and you get full potential from the hardware on it, then you would understand what I was talking about. I have talked to, this year alone, probably in the neighborhood of 2,000 or 3,000 people, either through social comments or directly or whatever, that have dumped Windows 10 and they have gone to Linux, and every single one of them has said exactly the same thing. I cannot believe how well this machine runs now that I've gotten rid of Windows. So put all of the freedom and open source stuff aside. Windows just plain sucks when compared to what Linux can do with a computer. And that's creeping, that's going to catch up with Microsoft sooner or later. And if we know it, they know it, and they're looking at this other platform and going, how can we move over there? So at some point in time, I think that's what they're going to do. I think that's where we're going, is that Microsoft is going to offer Linux, change the base of Windows to a Linux or something like that. That's where we're going with it. So we'll see what happens, but that's my prediction. How's that? And I still don't think dual booting is a good idea. I don't support it, and I don't think you should do it if you're just starting out with Linux. The very best thing that you can do is, number one, if you just want to learn how to use VirtualBox. That's free and open source. You can run it on Windows. You can run it on Mac. It takes a little bit of tinkering. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but you can run any Linux distribution you want in there, especially Linux Mint or Ubuntu. So you can learn that way. The other way to do it is to go and find an old junk computer, like a little netbook, laptop, something like that. Anything with a 64-bit processor in it with standard graphics of any kind. It could be Intel, it could be AMD, doesn't matter. It's going to work. There's open source drivers for all of that. And make sure it has like 4 gigs of memory, and it's got a hard drive in it that is over like 10 gigabytes. You can install a Linux system on 10 gigs. It's all you need. And then just dump Linux onto this thing and then have it running to the side and play with it and figure out what you can do with it. It's the best way to learn. Don't dump your Windows system. Don't screw your Windows system up by doing a dual boot. No, leave that alone. Go ahead and continue to use that. As you learn more about Linux, you become more confident with it. You get used to the workflow. You get new programs. Then that will be really cool. That's how you do it. So thank you for watching, gang. This is EzeeLinux 18.0, the very first show for the year. I appreciate you watching it. The sky's the limit. Who knows where we're going to go? I am very excited for 2018. I think it's going to be a great year for Linux. And I'm going to leave you on this note. I was going through some stuff, trying to figure out what to keep and what to dump. And here's a couple of comments that I got in 2017. And I just think this is just awesome. So the first comment I got that I held on to was, please don't do videos anymore. You don't have the knowledge to talk about any computer software. You're confusing people. And then this comment came in as well this year. I'm currently going for my BS in cybersecurity and have taken a few Linux classes, and I have to say, you by far are the best teacher as of yet. Thank you. And that came from Randolph. And that's what I'm going to leave you on. That's what 2017 has been like for me, and I'm hoping that 2018 is going to be great for you as well. Be sure to check out EzeeLinux on the web. Check out EzeeLinux on Facebook. Also check out freedompenguin.com for all kinds of great stories about Linux, and new videos from EzeeLinux will be syndicated there as well. Matt Hartley is the proprietor at Freedom Penguin. Always something interesting to talk about. Always something interesting to look at on freedompenguin.com. Talk to you again soon.